NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, along with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, have kicked off the extraordinary meeting of NATO Ministers of Foreign Affairs today at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. They're meeting in an effort to coordinate a response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as its long-term implications. Joining us now to discuss the position is DW News Europe correspondent Christine Mundwa. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. NATO's Secretary General was very clear on NATO's position, almost setting the tone on where they stand with the conflict. What did you make of those assertions that were put out?
That's right, Mpho. In fact, one of the major things coming into this is throughout this week, you have been hearing the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calling for a no-fly zone to be imposed or established over Ukrainian airspace. Now, what that would effectively mean is that NATO would have to be monitoring Ukrainian airspace, and in the event that Russian aircraft were in it, NATO would have to take the decision to shoot that aircraft down. That is effectively NATO in direct confrontation with Russia. And we were told by the foreign ministers of a number of European countries, including the foreign minister of Luxembourg, who said that is effectively a catastrophic thing to do, that could effectively trigger World War III. So coming into this, of course, it is the repeated assertion, as you were saying, the denouncement of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And of course, the NATO alliance is bolstered by that vote that we saw at the United Nations condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, historic in the sense that the amount of countries that supported that resolution, but also in general calling for the Russians to withdraw. So one thing is clear, this repeated call by the Ukrainian president for NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukrainian airspace, they're not going to be entertaining that. They're not going to be doing that. There is just no appetite among NATO allies to escalate this conflict. That is how NATO sees it, that establishing that no-fly zone would be an escalation of this conflict that could take us to a place where World War III is a very real possibility.
And where does this now place the talk around Vladimir Putin's anti-NATO rhetoric and Russia's aggression towards NATO? How does that now fall into this conversation?
Well, the conversation is now about NATO members, other NATO members, and their integrity in terms of their sovereign integrity. You will know, for example, that former Soviet republics from the Baltic states, I'm talking about Lithuania, I'm talking about Latvia, I'm talking about Estonia, these countries now fear for their territorial integrity. They fear that after Ukraine, that Russia could be eyeing them next. So NATO, for its part, has continued to prepare itself to defend its allies. NATO is a defensive ally. It wouldn't necessarily go into a confrontation with Russia unless it was defending one of its allies. These states, the Baltic states and other eastern states, Romania, Poland, for example, have long been calling for NATO to continue to strengthen its force. And we're seeing more of that happen. Indeed, in this week, we know NATO has announced that it's sending more troops to what we call the eastern flank. It's these countries that I've mentioned, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and others. That is more U.S. troops being deployed to existing NATO units there, in addition to the capacity that is already there, bolstering more equipment in the event that a NATO member does come under attack, which is, for some more than others, a very real possibility. But again, this alliance is looking to further strengthen. And of course, among the Europeans, it's another conversation that's opening up about a common European defense.
And what more do we know about the nuclear power plant that came under attack last night and has now been seized by Russian forces?
That's right, Mpho. That nuclear power plant is Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. It supplies the Ukrainians with a quarter of Ukraine's power supply. I'm going to quote for you here the head of the International Atomic Agency. He said that all the safety systems, because it did come under attack, we saw a massive fire at that nuclear power plant. But the head of the International Atomic Agency, that's Rafael Rossi, he said that all the safety systems of the reactors, it's got 6 reactors, were not affected and that there's been no release of radioactive material. But that attack on that power plant has basically been referred to as one of the most reckless things that Russia has done, because if one of those reactors had been hit in that attack, we would have been, of course, having a very different scenario right now. So what we know is the Russians have now seized it. Russian forces are on the ground. They've taken over that nuclear power plant. But again, for Western allies looking at this, it's just another indication that the Russians are not relenting, and that any reckless move could really escalate this to a serious place.
And how does this now speak to the very people on the ground whose lives have been turned around very drastically, fighting for their livelihood, and also, I suppose, wanting the conflict to end, but also looking at their economic well-being?
Paul, this war, this Russian invasion into Ukraine has triggered Europe's biggest mass movement of people in decades. Just the scale at which people are fleeing. It reached the 1 million mark in less than 7 days. That just gives you a sense of just how much people are fleeing Ukraine in big drones. Most of those fleeing, of course, are Ukrainian women and children, because men aged between 18 and 60 have to stay behind because they might be caught up to fight. But if you listen to the testimonies of people fleeing, it is just the grief of having to not only leave loved ones behind in some cases, but also leave everything behind, lives behind. The reality is nobody really knows when this is coming to an end, and all hopes of some kind of a quick de-escalation continue to fade by the day. There have been talks between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations taking place at that border with Belarus, but it doesn't appear that they're making any headway on that. So it is, as more attacks destroy critical infrastructure in the country, many people have nothing to return to if this were to end, even in the next foreseeable short term. So there is a sense that this is a country that has to do loads of rebuilding, and I'm talking under the assumption that this does come to some kind of an end. But by all indications, and certainly the German foreign minister reiterated this morning, saying, Annalena Baerbock, saying that it does appear that the Russians are not going to stop. What they're looking for is effectively to occupy the entire Ukraine. And many people just don't see a life under Russian occupation in Ukraine, and probably wouldn't be returning if that were to be the case. And certainly if that were to be the case, well, we can expect that there'll be some kind of an insurgency in Ukraine, anti-Russian insurgency, that would be funded by the West, as they are currently now supporting the Ukrainian armed forces with weaponry and other technical know-how in terms of fighting the Russian armed forces. But it does look very bleak, the scenario, and anybody who we're speaking to, analysts, experts looking in on this, are really preparing for a long, drawn-out, protracted, some kind of a, maybe not war, but certainly an insurgency fighting the Russian occupation.
Sure. Some shocking realities there. Thank you so much for your time. Let's leave it there for now. Christine Munda, a Europe correspondent for DW News, speaking to us about what's happening on the ground and NATO's voice to the current conflict.